According to The Telegraph, Iranian officials have warned that posting video footage of women removing their mandatory headscarves in public could lead to up to 10 years imprisonment, according to media reports. Nevertheless, The Independent reports soon after that Iranian women are sharing videos of themselves removing their headscarves in public, despite a recent ruling they could face 10 years in jail for doing so. Although wearing a hijab is a compulsory law in Iran, many have been pushing back. One way is seen in the movement called My Stealthy Freedom, which began back in 2014 and utilizes platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Here, women share videos and pictures of themselves with no head coverings, in direct opposition to Iranian law. According to their Facebook page, the initiative reflects the concerns of Iranian women who face legal and social restrictions. All of the photos and captions posted have been sent by women from all over Iran, and this is a site dedicated to Iranian women inside the country who want to share their stealthily taken photos without the veil. With that said, women who engage in activities like this do so at their own risk. According to the Jerusalem Post, 3 women who have been held in Iranian custody since April of this year for disrespecting compulsory hijab have been sentenced by the Iranian Revolutionary Court to prison terms of at least 16 years each for disobeying the country's Islamic dress code. Such appears to be part of a broader problem. According to Human Rights Watch, women's rights are severely restricted in Iran, to the point where women are even forbidden from watching men's sports in stadiums. It adds that women confront serious discrimination on issues such as marriage, divorce, and child custody. This situation seems to be a clear-cut case of widespread sexism, and it raises the question, what should feminists do about this? Asking this isn't an arbitrary question. After all, some charge feminists in places like the US with complaining about trivial things, fabricating problems, or over-exaggerating the extent to which women are oppressed in society. Moreover, others argue that there is an odd silence in their activism. Namely, they tend to neglect women who are suffering in the worst situations around the globe. This silence applies especially to places like Muslim-majority countries, perhaps out of fear of being called Islamophobic. They may also show a more general reluctance to critique other cultures, again, perhaps out of fear of being labeled a bigot, intolerant, or racist. What a lot of these criticisms boil down to is that feminism doesn't give an adequate amount of attention to women who are facing the worst kinds of oppression in the world, and instead tend to complain about relatively trivial things. Granted, there is some pushback to this type of critique. Part of it deals with arguing that the condition of countries like the US are far worse than some may realize or be willing to admit. For example, there were a handful of articles reporting on how the US was ranked in the top 10 most dangerous countries for women. Obviously, this is a contested claim, but it does go to illustrate that some believe the state of women in our own country is far worse than many think. Additionally, it may be that some feminists do deeply care about women around the globe. For example, Bustle published an article describing 7 ways that Western feminists can help women in developing countries. Such at least seems to suggest that there are those who genuinely care about what's going on around the globe, and are making an effort to improve the conditions of those struggling in other parts of the world. However, even the author of this article claimed that, as passionate as I am about feminism, and as many awesome Western feminists as I've met, I can't seem to stop thinking about how Western feminism often fails women in developing nations. Adding that, my concern is this: whether the majority of Western feminists, myself included, are failing to see feminism as a global issue. With that said, there may be certain lines of feminist thought which are more conscious of what is going on in other parts of the world. Such may be the case with what has been called transnational feminism. According to everyday feminism, transnational feminists examine issues from a global perspective, while considering how they intersect with our lived experiences in the United States. While Western feminism overemphasizes commonalities with women across nations, transnational feminism recognizes inequalities across different groups of women. Although we all might identify as women, the ways in which global issues affect us is not always the same. And, more importantly, our positions of privilege and/or disenfranchisement can change depending on our geographical location. Transnational feminists always consider the global impact of the issues for which they advocate. This aligns with a point that I think needs to be reinforced. Feminism is not a homogeneous entity. There is a tremendous amount of variation within it. While some may focus on more local issues, others may incorporate a much broader perspective into their worldview. When it comes to thinking about the issues I've just described, a handful of questions are worth considering. First off, what is the state of women's rights around the globe? Are they all equal, or are some countries better or worse off than others? At the heart of this type of an evaluation are questions like, how do we assess this, and are these assessments accurate? One key component involves what variables need to be assessed. It's important that we investigate all relevant variables when making our decisions. If we only look at sexual assault, we may come to different conclusions about which country is worse off than if we only look at domestic violence. Or, if we only look at voting rights, we may miss out on issues related to reproductive rights. In addition to ensuring that we are considering all relevant information, it's also important for us to consider whether some of these variables are more important than others. For example, is the wage gap as serious of a problem as the right to vote? Or, is paid maternal leave just as important as combating sexual assault? We also should consider how these variables are assessed. Are some of them easier to measure than others? For example, whether women have the right to vote may be easier to assess than the prevalence of sexual assault. By examining this issue, we may find that there are some relevant aspects of this topic which we simply do not know much about. In answering these types of questions, it's important for us to ask whether the assessments we are making of other countries are fair. To assess this, we must ask if we are using a standard or criteria that is perhaps culturally biased towards some countries over others. Or does it reflect true, absolute principles that can be applied universally? Finally, when it comes to evaluating the conclusions that people arrive at, it's important that we gain an understanding of the methods that they employed. We must look into how people arrived at their conclusions. If someone is going to claim that the US is one of the top 10 most dangerous countries for women, it's important to investigate how they arrived at this conclusion. With that said, simply assessing whether some countries are worse off than others is not the end of the discussion. There are also questions to consider about what the answer to these questions imply. In other words, if some countries are worse off than others, then what? Do those who are better off have an obligation to help those who are worse off? Perhaps their privileged position affords them resources which would be helpful in aiding those who are less fortunate. Moreover, there is a cost to doing nothing. It may allow the oppressed state of those around the globe to persist. From this perspective, a very noble case for intervening can be made. However, there are also some potential challenges when intervening. A lot of this deals with, if we do intervene, how exactly should we get involved? One approach may be to focus on working with the people in these areas, serving as a support system for them as they lead the way. Another approach would focus more on advancing our own interventions based on what we think is best. In this context, we are in more control over what goals are pursued and how they are achieved. Part of the difference between these perspectives is highlighted by the question, who knows better? Are we in the place to tell other countries what changes they need to make and how to make them? Or are the activists and protesters in these countries in a better place to guide us? If we take matters primarily into our own hands, some concerns may arise. While in principle things may work out fine, this approach may allow for bad actors to intervene in unjust ways. For example, rather than focus on truly helping those in need, they may use the intervention as a way to promote personal agendas. We also need to be cautious about imposing our views on them. Presumably, some aspects of our culture reflect universal values, while other aspects are subjectively determined. With that said, it may be the case that the line between these two isn't always easy to establish. What this means is that, if one were to intervene, one must take precautions to make sure that we are truly promoting universal values and not simply our own cultural practices. In closing, hopefully this video has offered an overview of some key issues that arise when it comes to how we ought to respond to the state of women's rights around the globe. One key issue focuses on the question, are some countries better than others? And, perhaps more specifically, are Western values superior to those in other cultures? This is likely to be a topic of much disagreement, as was illustrated in the Intelligence Square debate, where the proposition that was being discussed was, we should not be reluctant to assert the superiority of Western values. This topic also touches upon how one views Western society, especially with regards to its role in the world. Critics may highlight the damage it has done, referencing things like colonialism, imperialism, and failed foreign interventions. Such may cause us to question whether it is our place to get involved in the affairs of other countries. And yet, others may argue that, if it's right to promote equality within our own borders, then certainly it's important to promote it elsewhere as well. Such is built on the idea that we, as humans, are all equal, and we are obliged to aid those who are in need. With that said, although this may be noble in principle, actually accomplishing it can be a challenge. Numerous books have been written on how foreign aid to other countries has failed, showing that good intentions aren't enough. Any efforts to help others must be accompanied by a rigorous evaluation of whether these efforts are actually effective in bringing about the desired results. With that said, I'll end things here. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.